Welcome to the first History of University Life seminar for 2020. My name is Julia Horne and I'm Associate Professor in the Department of History at the University of Sydney and co-convenor of History of University Life with Matthew Thomas and Derek Schroeder. I acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation on whose land we broadcast today. It's upon their ancestral lands that the University of Sydney is built. So as we share our knowledge and research practices today, may we also pay respect to the knowledge embedded forever within the Aboriginal custodianship of country. I also pay respect to Gadigal elders, past and present, and to First Nations people who are attending this seminar. So our first seminar examines the statement, "University education is a pathway to employment." Of course, this topic seems more relevant than ever after the Minister of Education on Friday announced far-reaching changes to HECS fees and university funding for teaching university courses. So there are many reasons for discussing this statement, but two in particular are relevant to the History of University Life seminar. First, what exactly needs to be reformed and why? Australia's university system is a product of much reform and change since 1850, when the first university was established in the colonies. The last significant key reform moment was in 1988, when the Dawkins reforms dismantled a diverse public college sector in order to create a mass higher education system, with universities as its prime mode of education delivery. A major aim of Dawkins and the Labor government was to produce graduates, including those with humanities and social sciences degrees, to work on an increasingly deregulated and international economy. Young people with degrees were seen as crucial to the success of the economy, and a mass system was seen as an important issue of fairness to help extend higher educational franchise to a much more diverse population of young people than ever before. In the 30 years since this reform, while there's still a way to go, nonetheless, Australia's public university sector is one of the largest mass higher education sectors globally, at least on the basis of population parity. In New South Wales, for example, more than 40% of 25 to 34-year-olds have university degrees, with well over 90% of those graduating from public universities. Furthermore, modelling suggests more than 6 out of 10 Australians attend university at some point by the age of 22. The second reason for examining this statement today is that the sheer size and purpose of Australia's public universities mean they are actually important players in both Australian society and its economy. So with all this talk of job keeper, job maker, and now job ready, where is, as Sue Goodwin asked in May, the Uni Keeper Plan? Today we have two experts from different disciplinary backgrounds to give some substance to the statement, university education is a pathway to employment. Ariadne Vromen is a political sociologist whose long-term research interest is in the social and political participation of young people. She has a new collaborative ARC linkage project on Australian young women's working futures, and her recent books include Digital Citizenship and Political Engagement, published in 2017, and The Networked Young Citizen, published in 2014. Sue Goodwin is a sociologist who researches social policy and social change. She too has a new collaborative ARC discovery project on community organising in Australian education policy in the 70s and 80s. Her recent books include Post-Structural Policy Analysis, published in 2016, co-authored with Carol Backey, as well as the co-authored Working Across Difference, Social Work, Social Policy and Social Justice, published in 2019. Also published last year was Higher Education, Pedagogy and Social Justice, which is a most interesting co-edited collection of essays. So welcome to you both. Now the structure today is that Ariadne and Susan will each give a short presentation before we open up to questions. We had planned that these would be through a convenient Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, but we're having some problems there. But you will be told as we go on how you can answer your questions at the end of the presentations. For the tweeters among you, do please use our brand new Twitter handle at HUL Seminar. And let's cross our fingers that all the technology works smoothly, and apologies for that, for the beginning. So first we have Ariadne Vromen, Professor at the Crawford School of Public Policy at the ANU and Deputy Dean of Research at ANZOG, the Australian and New Zealand School of Government, who will address the question of what do we owe young people in regard to jobs and employment. So welcome, Ariadne.
Thanks, Julia, and thanks for inviting me to speak on this panel today. And I guess by framing this already about what we owe young people, I'm making a point about we owe young people active citizenship. And part of thinking about that relationship between university education and employment is central to that question of citizenship. Since the 2008 Great Financial Crisis, the effect on Australia was not as overt, but we've seen a slow burn with the deterioration in young people's economic security, their independence and their political voice. But at the same time, as this chart shows, we've seen a dramatic increase in their engagement in higher education, with 40% of 19-year-olds now at university and 50% of young women in particular. So thinking about the central question of citizenship, we need to be thinking about what are those pathways and pathways to education and work, and how are we actually ensuring increased equality for young people, today's young people, and enabling their social and economic rights. Part of the kind of central question we want to introduce in our talks today is really thinking about the active exclusion of young people from both employment and education and how that group of young people is growing. Okay, yep, sorry. I was being distracted by technical issues, but we're all okay. And also by putting citizenship at the centre, it's about making transparent whether or not young people have the capacities to really make a life of their own, whether or not they're able to achieve economic independence, and what this moment of COVID is bringing into sharp focus as well. So with that 1.4 million university students that we have enrolled in Australia right now, this is a mass education moment. University is central to the lives of many young people, as are other forms of further education too. And some of the debates that are going on at the moment between different sectors of education, between the STEM or science disciplines, and between the humanities and social science disciplines, arguably are a false binary. Then we need to be thinking much more deeply about that relationship between education and economic security for young people. And so I want to go on to my next slide now, please. So in thinking about how we owe young people security, how we owe young people citizenship status today, it's really worth thinking about what's happening right now. And what we're seeing is that there are growing problems of economic security and employment for young people. I've taken this chart from a fantastic report that was released by Per Capita think tank this week, written by Shirley Jackson. It's called Coming of Age in a Crisis, and it's really looking at what's happening to young people right now. And if you look at the chart that contrasts, say, around February, youth unemployment was at around 10% or 12% or so. Youth unemployment is now, if we're looking particularly, and I can look at the coloured lines, I think, the total unemployed is the purple line, 25%, is that right? No, total, yep, sorry, the sort of, the lighter purple line and the dark purple line. The lighter purple line, 20% of young people are currently unemployed, but an additional 25% are underemployed, in that they're not getting enough hours during the week to be able to live off. And then we've got the 20% of young people who are not being counted at all, because they're not either in the employment market and they're not in education, what people refer to as NEET. And so what we're seeing is this is a problem of underutilisation. We have over 60% of young people right now who do not make enough money in the labour market to live on. They're not making enough money to achieve economic independence and to have some form of economic security. And a lot of this is from industries that have been affected by COVID in particular. Fast food, hospitality, retail, the arts. A lot of these sectors have shrunk or closed down altogether, and these are the industries that young people are working in. More than 40% of the workforce is younger than 24, but a lot of these industries have not been able to access JobKeeper. People have gone on to unemployment benefits and so on. But it's telling you that there's this radical transformation of the labour market that's happening right now, and young people are at the pointy end of that. Shirley, in the Coming of Age in a Crisis report, argues that this 60% of young people are underutilised is the highest rate since the Great Depression. So we are seeing something really significant happening right now, where two out of three young people nearly do not have enough work to meet their needs. So what this is also pointing out to us, and what we need to think about, is that these industries where young people were working or are not getting enough work now or are unemployed altogether were hardly industries that they were able to build careers out of. These are traditionally industries, thinking again, fast food, hospitality, retail, the arts. There is chronic insecurity. There are not career jobs or security in these industries. People are usually working casually. They're working in ad hoc hours that differ week to week. So there's already a lot of wage theft and exploitation and low wages and insecurity happening in those areas where young people are concentrated. Up until before COVID, we already knew that 50% of young people were in insecure work. So there was already a problem that's been boiling away for young people in terms of their employment and their future security. Before COVID, the COVID moment is just making this a lot worse, and we don't necessarily have a young people targeted set of solutions about what's going to happen next in the workforce. Okay, I'll go to my next slide, which takes me to a lot of the debates that are happening now about university education, and that we need to be focusing on restructuring university education to focus on vocational skills. The term of the week is we need to be thinking about, well, what makes a job-ready graduate? And what we've seen is the emphasis in the discussion so far is that it's studying science, technology, engineering, and so on. So the STEM disciplines are what give you the skills to be job ready, as opposed to the humanities, arts and social sciences that don't supply you with the skills to be job ready. Arguably, this is a really false binary and a problematic one about what university education is for. Skills that are very sort of targeted on particular jobs quickly become outdated. It's not necessarily what universities are best at doing. Instead, universities really should be focusing on knowledge creation, and increasing understanding, critical skills and understanding of particular disciplinary areas, and increasingly interdisciplinary areas as well. So this is sort of one part of this debate, but the other part of the debate is actually thinking about what the job market looks like in general and where job creation is happening. Where we're seeing increasingly over the last 10, 15 years, the main areas of the job market increasing where we've seen growth are in the services industry and in care work. So care work in childcare, in aged care, in healthcare and so on, and the broad sort of services, retail, hospitality and so on. These are kind of the growth areas. But at the same time, we've also seen a collapse in traditional graduate job pathways. Even if we just think of the public sector alone, that was a traditional space where a lot of humanities and social sciences graduates would go in, there aren't the number of jobs that there used to be that are designated graduate positions. So we are seeing a collapse in that relationship, that overt relationship between university and possible pathways into jobs. So part of what I kind of think that we need to be arguing or thinking about in this discussion right now is, why are we asking universities to do all of the work here in thinking about creating job-ready graduates? Instead, we need to be thinking much more about job creation and what the policies are that need to be put in place for job creation and the partnerships that need to happen. Yes, universities can have a role, but we need to be putting much more responsibility back onto industry and back onto government for actually having a policy regime that focuses on creating jobs, and not just creating any job, creating good jobs. Industrial relations scholars will talk about high road jobs, which are jobs that are secure, which are based on careers that people can build a life on, that they can build that economic independence that now is becoming impossible for young people. But as I've already argued, most of the new jobs and where young people are concentrated, before COVID 50%, and now even increasingly, are low road jobs. And low road in terms of that they're insecure, they have no career path, people don't have, if you get sick, you do not get paid. So these sorts of jobs have been in the increase. And the other thing that I want to point out in my last minute is that these opportunities are not distributed equally amongst all young people. Some young people are having very different experiences. What we have seen though is the sort of middle class nature of insecurity growing, and this is part of why it's become a discussion more broadly about why we need job ready graduates, and it's come back to universities. But the class and gender effects are really quite pointed here. And here I've also taken from some research by a fantastic former student of mine, Felix Donovan, whose work on living class in a meritocratic Australia was really asking young people themselves how they understood these different opportunities for them in their post-school choices about whether or not to go to university, whether or not to focus on vocational education, or what they thought about the job market. And what this chart's showing is that young people from working class backgrounds, and particularly working class girls, recognise that their choices post-school are constrained. Middle-class kids still think that they have lots of options to go to university and that there will be jobs for them. I would argue that that's probably changing, and that's going to change even more so in this particular COVID moment, as everyone is seeing that their choices are more and more constrained because there just aren't those jobs available. And what this research also showed was that young people tend to sort of internalise that individual responsibility. They kind of think you just work hard at school and then you work hard at uni and then you will get a job. But that relationship really is obviously quite broken now. No matter how hard you work, no matter what aspirations you have, the future for young people is looking increasingly bleak, and we need to be putting that question back more and more towards government and towards industry for resolving these issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Ariadne. That was really wonderful. Just a quick follow-up question. Of course, in your own research, you speak to young people.
Yeah.
And what do they think?
Okay, so that's my next slide. Funnily enough, I haven't. Yep. So as Julia pointed out, while I'm increasingly interested in young people's futures and young people's work, and I've always sort of seen that their citizenship status is tied in with their social, political and economic rights, and also the practices within that. But I've done a lot of work in the past on young people's political engagement in particular. And one study that I was involved in really looked at, well, what do young people care about? There are a lot of assumptions made that young people are not concerned about their futures. But in the survey research we did, they rated this, and this was 5 years ago even, before the moment we're in now, they rated that education was their top concern, and using education to sort of further their working futures and their careers. So they were concerned about that, but they were also concerned about the possibilities of social mobility, about how they use education to get ahead, to get a good job, to get an independent and economically secure future. But there is this recognition, as I was pointing before, that young people, their choices remain structured, and they are to an extent more or less aware of that. And so what I've used here, rather than using the survey data, I've also used some of the focus group data that we did, and this quote on the right-hand side of this slide is from that. So in our focus groups with young people who were aged all around 20, we presented them with a cartoon. And in the cartoon, it was a picture that basically implied that if you were that there was a family background determinism to your opportunities in life. So if you were born poor, you would stay poor throughout your life no matter what. And if you were born rich, you would stay rich. So it was quite a sort of black and white kind of cartoon. And we threw this into some discussion groups to see how young people responded to that. And what was interesting to me is that, and what this quote shows, is that when young people talk with one another, this young male says, I don't agree with this. This makes me feel awful. It sort of says that no matter what you do, no matter what chances, you're sort of stuck in your particular social position. Whereas the other young woman in the focus group says, no, that's not true. You just, you can be from a working class background, but you can just work hard. This is sending the wrong kind of message. And then he kind of corrects himself and says, oh, no, you're right. It's a mistake to think that poverty just gets carried on, that it is socially determined and socially structured. And what I kind of think is interesting about this is this idea that young people carry this stuff. They carry this kind of myth of meritocracy, this myth that you just work hard, that it's your individual responsibility. So if you fail and you don't get ahead, it was your fault, rather than seeing that these things are socially structured and that maybe government policy making has a role to play here in supporting and encouraging young people towards more economic independence.
Fascinating. Yeah. So thank you, Ariadne. We're going to bring you back shortly for questions, but in the meantime, we have Susan Goodwin, Professor of Policy Studies at the University of Sydney, who will speak on Uni Keeper as a social democratic plan to support public higher education. So welcome.
Thank you. Thanks, Julia. And thanks, Ariadne, for that fabulous introduction to what are some of the key issues. Could I go to my first slide? Thanks. So a couple of months ago now, a group of us began thinking about what might be required in the context of the double whammy of mass youth unemployment that Ariadne has just described and the economic hit to universities as a result of COVID-19. It seemed to us that the new conditions required expanding public investment in higher education, and we began to outline what might be required for a higher education-led recovery. In what seems to be an anachronism today, we tag this the Uni Keeper Plan, the 3 planks of which are outlined in the left-hand column of the slide here. Then came Friday's announcements. Clearly the government's plan is at odds with ours. So over the weekend, Ariadne and I began rethinking the plan in a much more explicitly social democratic way. So today I'm presenting just some of the elements of our revised social democratic plan. I want to talk firstly about the need for more affordable places in public universities. I'm not going to go over the important affordability issues here today, but instead want to outline issues around extending the role of private providers. Secondly, I want to talk about the need for financial support for higher education students to ensure the citizenship rights of young people are protected. And thirdly, I want to talk about the need for a remaking of public universities as truly public institutions with adequate workforce protections. Next slide. So firstly, the need for more affordable public university places. In the government's plan for meeting increased need for places, apparently there's been an 88% rise in applications for admission just next year. So in the government's plan for meeting this increased need, there appears to be lots of gains for private higher education providers, including, for example, a plan for more teaching-only university colleges. So private higher education institutions include the private universities that we know of, like Bond, Torrens, and Notre Dame. But they also include what are called non-university higher education providers. Navitas, for example, is one of a number of for-profit providers. Navitas is now owned by an Australian private equity group. It currently runs 14 of the existing university colleges. Others in this category include not-for-profits, like the Christian colleges. Now, in the government's reform plans, the priorities of the private sector's lobby in Canberra, called ITECA, are clearly visible. For example, in this statement, government funding for education, training and skills needs to be fully contestable, where independent providers and universities compete equally, with funding awarded on the basis of being able to provide students with quality outcomes. Now, the term full contestability refers to the removal of barriers that prevent new suppliers from entering a market, implemented to promote competition and ostensibly consumer choice. From my research on contestability in other areas of social policy, it can be argued that actually, given public universities are already experienced and capable providers, further competition is unnecessary and will ultimately encourage all providers to overly focus on commercial objectives around revenue, costs, growth, profit, at the expense of social objectives such as quality, diversity, equity, and so forth. And whilst this may seem alarmist, we know this has already happened in the vet sector with the entry of cowboys and the denigration of the TAFE sector. So from my perspective, meeting new demands and the emergent demands for more university places therefore needs a real focus on public universities. Can we go to the next slide? So, as Ariadne outlined in her talk, young people are most at risk of poverty and social exclusion in the current labour market, and this has been exacerbated by COVID. In Australia, however, we do not have an adequate safety net or social protection framework for young people in higher education. Currently, only 1/3 of university students are eligible for government income support, meaning they need to rely on themselves or on their families financially. For the 1/3 who do receive student benefits, the current rate is well below the Henderson poverty line. As a result, the majority of university students, 82%, rely on paid employment, and these are largely the jobs that have disappeared. Now, there seems to be a misconception in the Australian community that these students who lose their jobs will simply be able to access government benefits. This is not the case. In Australia, young people are not considered independent and therefore eligible for government benefits until they are 22, and a parental means test is applied for anyone younger. In my field, we call this the extension of dependency, where young people's rights as independent citizens have been eroded and denied through social policy. To keep young people and their families out of poverty, to really provide them with the choice to study at university when employment has disappeared, and to ensure young people actually have full social citizenship, we need a universal student income support scheme. Next slide. So this is the third plank of our revised social democratic proposal. Finally, we need a plan to maintain and fund the public sector higher education workforce. The marketisation of higher education in Australia has, of course, also occurred within public universities. The marketisation is not just the emergence and support of private providers. In public universities themselves, neoliberal rationalities have been installed and market values are evident in all of our workplaces. One of the most pernicious effects of this has been to drive down costs of provision by using casualised and contracted labour. As on the slide, in some universities, more than 80% of staff under the age of 30 are insecurely employed in precarious, casual and contract jobs. It's worth remembering, however, that this exploitation extends well beyond teaching and research to the cleaning, IT, student services and curriculum development roles. It disproportionately affects young workers, people from minority and migrant backgrounds, and women. So introducing further contestability into the higher education market is not going to do anything to allay workforce precarity. The proposal to further support private teaching-only institutions, for example, is actually premised on lowering wages and lowering conditions. So to conclude, reforming higher education in a social democratic direction involves a really major framing of public universities and indeed of university workers themselves. Having now been thoroughly imbued with the values of individual enterprise in a competitive and global market, it will take some effort to remake universities as public services undertaken in public institutions for the public good. However, the new conditions that Ariadne has just outlined make this effort imperative.
Thank you, Sue. That also was wonderful too. Just a quick follow-up question. Should student income support be means tested? That might be a question in many people's minds. So perhaps you could just explain why it shouldn't be means tested.
Well, I think given that we have a very tightly targeted social security system in Australia, I would probably support the idea of students' own incomes being mean tested for the purposes of universal income support. So if you're earning a lot of money yourself, you would not be entitled to the income payments. However, on the basis of the youth citizenship argument, I don't agree with parental means testing of anyone over the age of 18. I think political and social citizenship in a democratic country needs to be aligned. I know then this will prompt arguments and horror about the idea of already very advantaged rich kids from really rich families, or even middle-class kids from middle-class families getting Centrelink. We call this middle-class welfare that everybody's frightened about. But I think that there are other mechanisms that can mitigate that kind of intergenerational inequality, including taxation policies that reduce massive parental income gaps. Another mechanism, for example, could be a higher education levy on middle or high income parents, which would mean that their income, their wealth, could be redistributed from higher income earners, not just to their own children, which is currently the case, but rather to all young people. And we've got an example of that in the existing Medicare levy, which redistributes middle and high incomes to the whole community, not just to your own children.
So it links in with Ariadne's point about citizenship.
Yes, absolutely.
So we're now reaching to the point where we want questions from the audience. I'm sorry that we didn't have a simpler form to do this, but it seems as though some people have already discovered how to post questions. So I have the first question that's come through, and it's actually
there are people out there, is what you're saying.
I'm using my phone at this stage because we have nothing else, and that is for either of you. How likely do you think it is that the government takes on board these recommendations? You might like to also expand that into how, what sort of political action is required, perhaps, to move the debate forward. Who would like to go first? Do you want to? Because you've been quiet for a bit.
Oh, okay. All right. Thanks, Julia. Okay, that's a big question, isn't it? I think there are two dimensions to that question about how likely is it that the government will take on board these kinds of policy recommendations. I think the first part of the question is we think the times are right, that we need to be saying something and that we need to be, even when Sue and I were talking about the talk today, we thought it was really important that we took a normative position about what is happening to university education and what's happening to young people in Australia in general. So it wasn't just about us telling you the evidence, which I hope you feel like we've presented a lot of today, that there are wide-ranging facets of this debate, but we also think that something needs to be said, that this is wrong and that something needs to change. There are also others in terms of the more short-term, immediate effects, in terms of the policy prescriptions that have come out last week, in terms of changing the level of fees for a variety of degrees within university. There is a lot of advocacy work going on at the moment, and I just want to do a bit of a shout out to some friends of mine who've got a petition going on Megaphone, which is particularly to support humanities and social sciences students and future students by not increasing the fees. If you're not aware of the actual proposal, since we haven't talked about the detail of that, I probably can flag a bit of that. So the proposal on the table is that the costs roughly $14,500 a year to educate an arts and social sciences student. Up until recently, the government has paid for about half of that. As of last week, the proposal is that students themselves will pay for 90% of that, meaning that arts degrees, a typical arts degree, 3-year arts degree, will cost them $45,000, that they'll start, in general, start to pay back through the tax system when they earn around $45,000 a year. This is makes this the most expensive degree for young people themselves, and it's not related to future earning capacities at all. It's a choice that the government is making to make these degrees to be funded predominantly by students themselves, and will make them inaccessible for a lot of young people, particularly those kinds of working class young people who are making those calculuses about what kind of debt to get into, what kind of post-school options they want to explore. So I think it's important that we have a voice right now to question that policy agenda.
So the questions are coming in thick and fast.
I thought I was filling space there.
So there's one which in some ways follows on from that and specifically addressed to you, to Sue. Could you perhaps describe whether Uni Keeper would not require universal social security system to accommodate and ensure less inequities in distribution if opportunities across in distribution of opportunities across society? I have to translate, typos too.
Yeah. Rapid response, all good.
So is the question whether or not a universal social security system would smooth the income disparities
Yes.
and produce opportunities?
Yes.
Beyond the universal, would a universal...
So would it require a universal social security system to accommodate and ensure fewer inequities in distribution of opportunities across society? So I think how you've framed it is what the question's asking.
So I think it would, yes. But I think it has to be in combination, I suppose, with other mechanisms for reducing income inequalities that we have. It's another thing that we haven't been talking about in relation to universities, is that all of the policies that are being suggested at the moment are in the context of increasing income inequality. So the problem, even in our own talk, has become unemployed young people or students in poverty, whereas there is a greater problem, and that's the problem of the failure in our system to distribute rewards more evenly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's a follow-up question from someone else, and that is, what aspects of public sector structures and cultures would you like to see embedded or even re-embedded within our university?
Well,
the sector more generally, I think.
The first one would be, the public sector working conditions that are understood by most public servants to be, minimum or maximum hours of work per week would be a really great place to start. But as I said, we've been imbued with the marketized culture of competition and productivity and individual entrepreneurship to the point that we are complicit in the very poor working conditions, the kind of self-exploitation. So that would be one shift in culture, to think of ourselves as public servants rather than as market players.
And for Ariadne, so how do we delink the rankings and universities, which this person is suggesting may have distorted our focus on preparing graduates for careers as opposed to job readiness? So it's quite a, so I suppose partly that's about marketisation too. So how, you know, how do we, I guess, stop becoming as obsessed about rankings in order to focus on that question of job readiness?
Yeah, okay. I mean, this is a hard question in that university rankings and the kind of fixation on those have grown in a period of time where the universities have been expanding, and they've been expanding because they've had to attract full fee paying and international students. So full fee paying master students are part of the picture, but also international students who often pay full fees as well. And that's because of the decline in public expenditure into universities that properly funds the costs of teaching, but also properly funds the costs of research. So we've kind of seen these dual pressures going on at the same time. So the higher the story is, the higher you go up in rankings, the more capacity you will have to attract those full fee paying students, both postgraduate coursework students and international students. So how we decouple that relationship, surely the answer has to be increased public expenditure back into universities that fully fund the cost of teaching and fully fund the cost of research. But that is a big policy debate.
And there's another, oh,
Can
sorry,
I
yeah,
just
sure,
add
yeah.
something about, you know, if we're thinking about universities and public good, it is a public good to prepare international students
totally.
to be job ready as well.
Yeah.
And we've done a great job in Australia of, you know, working on global inequalities through our higher education system.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point. I don't think I've been concerned by some of the conversations about international students as a cash cow. I think that's deeply problematic and slightly xenophobic. And I think we do need to recapture exactly what Sue is saying there, that we are doing this global public good of focusing on social mobility and increasing equality across the world as well.
And just as an example, the University of Sydney trained the first Southeast Asian vets who have been instrumental in eliminating foot and mouth disease. Yeah. They were job ready and they've done a great job.
Yeah, we should be proud of that.
So another one for you, how does the myth of meritocracy play into thinking and theorising the role of universities, both historically and in contemporary times? So I know part of that, you answer about contemporary times.
Yeah. Look, I think the myth of meritocracy probably works to the advantage of universities at some time, because so much of our end of school structures around, the HSC and so on are aimed at that kind of pathway into university. So I guess it's unpacking what those pathways actually should look like, and that they are made for young people themselves, and that they are able to facilitate young people securing social and economic independence, securing their citizenship rights. So I think it's bringing that part of the analysis back into how we talk about meritocracy, and that we actually also reveal a lot more the disadvantages and social structures that are baked in. And part of this is also about us talking about the university sector and its diversity as well, and how some universities, like the one that we're sitting in now, are much more privileged than other universities, and also cater to very different kinds of students too. So I think we need to be talking about the inequities that exist much more.
Do you want to add something to that from a sociologist and social policy?
I actually want to add something to the first question, which was about how realistic or are any of these kind of planks of our plan going to happen?
Oh yeah, the policy one. Yeah, good.
You better think about that.
I'd just like to really add that there is a lot of work being done advocating around the current government's plan. So what we're trying to present here is another way of thinking about what the problem is. Because while we're advocating that actually universities do make students job ready and students are job ready, we're accepting the government's definition of the problem, that the problem is job readiness. I think it's really important at the same time to be rejecting that problem definition. And one way to do that is in the ways that we have started this discussion, that the problem might be the privatisation of the sector. The problem might be student poverty, or the problem might be terrible working conditions of university workers.
What do you think of the term job ready? So, Sue, do you think that's a useful term at all?
No, and I guess part of what I was trying to say in sort of critiquing the idea of job ready is that this is not necessarily what universities do. Like, we facilitate thinking, a set of knowledges. We don't necessarily facilitate always job relevant skills. I think that's part of what universities can do, but it also then lets government and industry abdicate any responsibility at all for job creation and for also doing on the work job training, which traditionally was part of what those sectors did. You got a job, you learned the skills on the job, and how that was going to play out. So I think we need to bring that back into the picture, and we really need to reject that you walk out of university and that there are jobs there for you to go to as well when there aren't.
So, a second last question, I'm told by my question editor somewhere else in a different room. What would it take for employers to value arguably broader skills such as critical thinking, creativity, or content, the means to actually create content? Or do they already value, this is important, I think, but do they already value these and it's not being recognised by the government? It's a good question.
It is a great question, because it is kind of the crazy thing about this proposal is that every other government report is saying employers value not necessarily these kind of vocational competencies. What they value are critical thinking skills and everything that you just described. So I'm not quite sure why there's been this rejection of previous government reports or previous research that has underlined the importance of broader and more abstract skills in the current economy.
Yes, do you want to have a... it is, what we do see surveys where employers and, even I think it was the Chief Officer of the Council of Businesses in Australia, I may have got that title wrong, saying, in fact, critical thinking is really crucial to the way we do business. So do you want to add something to that? No?
No.
That's fine.
But having said that, I do want to add something, because that's been an academic's response, particularly from humanities and social sciences, is that we are preparing job-ready graduates, and through teaching this range of more skills that are more abstract, I suppose. But there are plenty of courses at universities that plenty of students go to where they are learning vocational skills. They're learning hard skills. Paramedic, for example, or so, plenty of courses. And in some ways, we're just ignoring those students and those courses by focusing on this other argument.
Yeah.
So as you know, there's much talk now of how universities might remodel themselves for a post-COVID world. So I wonder if you could both perhaps just briefly say who you'd like to participate in that. I don't mean, you don't have to name names here, but what groups or what types of people would you like to see participate in that discussion? And if it comes to it, they might even be reshaping the future of higher education in Australia.
Yeah, okay. Well, again, going with our overall premise, we need to democratise that discussion. That discussion is too much happening behind closed doors between lobbyists, between governments, between senior management officials at universities. And that's no longer good enough to be having those secret conversations from those particular entrenched interests. Really, the conversations need to be happening from the interests of the participants. So they need to be including young people, their families, but also the workers at universities. And I'd particularly like to see the next generation of academics. We've emphasised that we need to actually clean our own house in terms of that universities are not the best employers at all. They need to be creating high-road jobs. They need to be creating better security for a future generation of academics. They should be involved in these discussions as well, recognising their citizenship and their voice.
And who would you like to see?
Very similarly, I think we do need to democratise the discussion, and we need to open the discussion up ourselves. I think there's clearly a really great space for employee organisations, for parents, for high school teachers, for unions who could be involved in this discussion.
And professional organisations as well.
Particularly focused on the idea of higher education-led COVID recovery.
So there is actually a last question, but I don't expect you to answer it. But I shall read it.
The last question was the last question.
Yes, I know, but I shall read it, and that is, how does today's discussion fit into conversations about international students, education, financing, well-being, and particularly since the next History of University seminar focuses on this topic? So that's what I'd like to say. Unless you have some burning desire to answer that question, what I would like to say is please come back on Wednesday the 5th of August at 4 p.m, when in fact we will have a panel discussion on international students in Australian universities, and I shall make sure that we have some form of link between this seminar and what we'll be doing on that day. But I should say, is there anything you want to say about international students? I mean, it seems that you said that lovely point about how it is a public good. Anyway, what we do, it isn't just
and they're at the pointy end of not getting economic support during COVID.
Yes.
While they're still in Australia as well.
Yes.
So,
yes.
yeah, huge inequalities there.
And I'll certainly have a lot to say about that next time, as I'll be one of the panellists, along with Gabby Ramia and Matthew Thomas, and perhaps even a mysterious fourth person. We shall see whether that happens or not. So I really want to thank Ariadne and Susan for a wonderful presentation, and particularly to bring your disciplinary perspectives to a discussion which in history of university life is often taken up by historians. So it's not to say we're not unused to what you're saying, but to actually make the discussion very relevant to the contemporary situation today. So introducing the idea of citizenship to these discussions as we're facing the challenges of universities now, I think is really important, along with questions of universal income support. So thank you very, very much indeed. I think I have advertised the fact that the next seminar will be on international students in Australian universities on Wednesday the 5th of August at 4 p.m, and there will be notices sent out about that this time earlier than for this one. So thank you very much for joining us, and very much hope to have you join us the next time. Farewell.